Question 4, Kenneth Gibson.
To ask the First Minister what the impact will be on Scottish public services of the recent rises in VAT and fuel duty.
First Minister.
Well, the recent increase to VAT and fuel duty introduced by the United Kingdom Government will generate additional pressures for Scottish business and families, and indeed public services, at a time when Scotland is already facing unprecedented cuts in public spending and when economic recovery remains fragile. As Mr Gibson will be aware, the Scottish Government has written to the UK Government opposing these increases and, of course, making the case for a fuel duty stabiliser, something which was supported by the Prime Minister and the Chancellor before the election, but now they seem extraordinarily reluctant to introduce it just when the time is right for such an initiative.
Kenneth Gibson.
I thank the First Minister for his answer. Does I agree it is a shocking indictment of successive UK governments that they impose the highest fuel duty in Europe on Scottish motorists in order to maximise revenue? Most of Europe's oil comes from Scotland, and yet shamefully we pay more than any other nation at the pumps for it. This burden of additional UK VAT and fuel duty will make Scottish goods and services less competitive and cost jobs, with £2.4 billion drained from Scotland into Treasury coffers this year. Will he therefore engage with the UK Government to seek the restoration of funds taken by the Treasury from the Scottish bloc to avoid further cuts in public services, as well as the establishment of a fuel duty regulator?
First Minister.
Yes, I do, and yes, I will. I think it's probably worth just explaining the fuel duty regulator does not concern the £10,000 million of expected revenue from Scotland's oil and gas reserves flowing to the Treasury in the coming year. The fuel duty regulator makes the argument that when you have an oil price increase, an unexpected surge in revenues of £1 billion over and above that £10 billion, then some of that should be applied to looking at fuel duty to try and give a regulation and stability in the price at these times. That is something we have long argued for. It is something which the Prime Minister supported before the election, and I would not want to see the Prime Minister, in terms of making a major commitment and then breaking it, to go the same way as the Deputy Prime Minister has on tuition fees.
Question 5, Jackie Bailey.
To ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government will revisit plans to remove £10 million from the Scottish pandemic flu budget in light of concerns expressed regarding the potential rate of influenza A H1N1.
First Minister.
I don't think that Jackie Bailey did herself any service in terms of the way she raised this issue over the last 2 weeks. As she is well aware, the issue of the £10 million was a contingency for a flu pandemic. We have a serious flu issue in Scotland at the present moment, as indeed they have elsewhere in the United Kingdom. We do not have a pandemic position, and if the circumstances were to change in the next year, then we would handle these circumstances as indeed the Health Secretary handled things when we did have a pandemic in Scotland. Now, I think these things, as far as possible, in my view, should be handled by a united Parliament and a united Chamber. But I would have to say that even the sternest critics of this administration would probably concede two things. Firstly, that the Health Secretary and our outstanding health service handled the flu pandemic last year with great efficiency and skill. And secondly, I would just gently remind Jackie Bailey that the position in terms of preparations for the seasonal flu outbreak this year, for example in the supply and availability of vaccine, seems somewhat more robust in Scotland, perhaps, than they do elsewhere.
Jackie Bailey.
Can I associate myself with the First Minister's comments about the NHS because they have pulled out all the stops to deal with flu. But I am sure that the First Minister will equally agree that we need to avoid any complacency in dealing with H1N1 flu strains in future years. He will of course be aware that flu viruses can mutate, that vaccines might need to vary and stocks increase to deal with this. Can I ask him, will there be any contingency budget available if the £10 million is removed? And secondly, is he aware of the increasing concern highlighted by the Chief Medical Officer in England about mortality rates for people with co-infection, particularly Group A streptococcal infection and meningococcal disease? Can I ask him what contingency plans the Scottish Government have in place to deal with this?
We have a full preparatory contingency both for that and indeed, of course, the preparatory budget which remains in place. We are not talking here, as Jackie Bailey I think is well aware, about the budget for this year in terms of this year's seasonal flu preparedness. We are talking effectively about a contingency budget for the purchase of vaccine in the event of a pandemic. Now, there are a number of reasons why you don't invoke such a budget if you are not in a pandemic situation, not the least of which, as Jackie Baillie is also aware, that flu vaccine has a shelf life. It has a shelf life after which it cannot be used. And although we have to combine maximum preparedness and the availability to respond to any situation, equally, nobody would argue for the purchasing of pandemic vaccine in a situation where the shelf life might run out if you were not facing a pandemic and a major misuse of public spending, which could, of course, be reinforcing the health service superb handling of the current flu situation in Scotland. And finally, can I welcome and recognise that we have unity in the praise for our health service workers, NHS 24, the doctors and nurses and chemists of Scotland in the way they are handling the flu situation in Scotland at the present moment.
Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. The First Minister will be aware of calls from some parents for vaccination of all young children against flu, a call which, however, does not have scientific or medical support. Can I ask him, where does the Scottish Government stand on this issue?
First Minister.
Well, we follow the expert advice from the relevant committee. In that sense, both the health departments north and south of the border follow the same advice. I think these are always difficult judgments to make, but in these circumstances, to follow the best medical advice, and the committee established to do that, it would seem to me to be the sensible and proper thing to do.
Question 6, Robert Brown.
Presiding Officer, can I ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to deal with court delays caused by legal aid problems?
Minister.
Well, the Scottish Legal Aid Board introduced changes on 16 August 2010. These changes were intended to simplify and modernise the operation of the Scottish legal aid system. The changes, of course, have been closely monitored to ensure the profession and the wider justice community are fully aware of them and to speed up decisions on legal aid applications.
Robert Brown.
I'm very grateful to the First Minister for his reply, but my concern was raised by reports of adjournment of criminal cases in sheriff courts across the country, from Wick, where 5 out of 18 cases called were put off for this reason recently, and which was the subject of judicial comment from the bench, to Glasgow, allegedly caused by new legal aid procedures requiring more financial documentation than before, to which, of course, the First Minister has referred. Now, lawyers are claiming that changes were introduced without consultation. I do accept entirely that people getting criminal legal aid have to support their application properly, but does the First Minister accept that the net effects on the public purse is entirely the wrong way if trials are put off at substantial public cost, to say nothing of the frustration and inconvenience to witnesses? Will he ensure that the Scottish Legal Aid Board sort out the difficulties causing these costly delays as a matter of some urgency?
First Minister.
Well, let's look precisely at the case that Robert Brown raises. In the case at Wick Sheriff Court on the 5th of January, none of related directly to the changes introduced last August. The point was that legal aid had been granted in one of the cases. Legal aid was refused in 2 cases because the applicants earned more than the means-tested threshold. 2 were continued because the applicants earned more than the mean-tested thresholds, and 2 were continued because a bank statement and other verification of income had not been provided. The solicitors and applicants, of course, have the prime responsibility to ensure that the information is provided properly. Otherwise, quite clearly, a legal aid decision cannot be granted. The Board, however, has been working with the profession to ensure that there is full understanding of last year's changes and to avoid mistakes which can result in court delays.
James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When Parliament passed emergency legislation in October as a result of the Cadder judgment, we were told it would require 500 additional police officers and also result in an increase in the legal aid budget. Can the First Minister say what actions the Scottish Court Service are taking to ensure that the new arrangements minimise the impact on legal aid procedures and also the legal aid budget?
First Minister.
Well, obviously, all new arrangements in terms of legal aid budgets and procedures are closely monitored. I would caution the member. I mean, one of the things that we're always told in politics is not to believe everything you read in the papers. I don't think the Labour members should necessarily believe the propaganda points they made during a debate. But let me assure the member that these matters are all properly considered, both in terms of the change of legislation and indeed the consequences that has for legal aid.
That concludes questions to the First Minister, and I suspend this